Good morning. Oh, I am so excited to be here in Orlando. This is the first time I've spoken here, so thank you for your warm welcome. I'm going to do a deep dive today for designers, front-end developers, content editors, everybody who works on websites with site speed in mind, right? Images, fonts, markup, and at the end, we're going to do Q&A. So start thinking about your questions now. So as Eric mentioned, I wrote a book with the same title here, Designing for Performance. I also work at Etsy, where I work with teams of developers to help make all of the front end of this website load more quickly, be more accessible, have a lot of design patterns that work with our apps as well, too. And what we've learned, and what many of us in the room have learned over the years, is that performance is absolutely part of the user experience, right? It's being factored into search engine results, and its effects on user behavior are being studied by major sites. And what those studies have found is that users expect our sites to load in 2 seconds or less. Worse, after 3 seconds, up to 40% of your users are going to abandon your site. So think about how you search for things on the web, right? How quickly are you going to close a tab and move on to something next if a site is taking too long to load? And we at Etsy absolutely have found this. We ran an experiment specifically to determine what the effect on our users would be if we slowed down the mobile website. We added 160 kilobytes of hidden images to the page, meaning nothing else was affected, no layout, nothing looked visually different except it took longer to load. And we triggered a 12% increase in bounce rate on mobile web. Oh, just the worst. But conversely, when we eliminated jank, and jank is that stuttering when you're scrolling through a website, when we eliminated jank, people favorited things more often and favorited more of them in general. DoubleClick ran an experiment and found this too. They removed a redirect, and they found that they increased click-through rate by 12% on mobile devices. This is great, right? Like, we can start to focus on these things and make the case, but really historically, our industry has not designed for performance. We're designing sites with increasingly rich content, lots of dynamic elements, larger JavaScript files, beautiful animations, complex graphics, etc. We may optimize design and layout for mobile, but we don't always optimize for page speed on mobile. And some responsively designed sites are irresponsible with the amount of page weight that we need to load the page. But fast page load time does a whole bunch of really great things for you and your visitors, right? It builds trust in your site. It will increase the number of visitors who return to your site. It'll increase the number of people who choose you over a competitor. More people will be trusting your brand. This good user experience yields a ton of good things for you and your site, and optimized page speed is a huge part of it. So what I want to talk about today is performance and aesthetics. I'm not going to stand up here and say, make the fastest site humanly possible, because it's probably going to be really ugly and overall be an iffy user experience. But what I want to do is remove this antagonistic feeling that we have. It's not performance versus aesthetics, right? We want to talk about the entire user experience, and performance is a part of it. So I'm going to talk a lot about mobile, and I want to just give us all a foundation of why mobile is really important in this context. So before a device can transmit or receive data, it has to establish a radio channel with the network. And I'm going to visualize this with a little hand-wavy diagram. This process of connecting to the radio tower and then our host, which returns these files to the tower and then again to our user, can take several seconds. And the best part is, if there is no data transmitted or received, after a timeout, that channel is going to go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. This can obviously wreak havoc on our web page load times. And on our typical US desktop using Wi-Fi, a request's average round trip takes about 50 milliseconds. But on a mobile network, it's more than 300 milliseconds. This is as slow as old dial-up connections, if any of you remember those. And this process has to repeat over and over and over again in order to get all that data back to your user's browser. And most of the time, that browser has to acknowledge each chunk of data that gets back. Not each file, each chunk of each file. So you can see how this stuff adds up. So I'm going to talk a lot about how we're going to be optimizing for this network. Who in here has used web page test before? Yeah, great. Okay, for those of you who haven't, this is my #1 go-to tool for assessing how fast a site is taking a load and what some of the problems are with it. It's free. Please go run your site through it right now. I will wait. You'll be bummed out, but then I'll show you how to fix it. So the perception of how fast your site loads is way more important than how long it actually takes to load. Users' perception of speed will be based on how quickly they start to see content, how quickly it becomes interactive, and how smoothly the site scrolls. So let's use another hand-wavy diagram for this. First, we're going to go and fetch the HTML. That HTML is going to tell us that we need CSS and JavaScript. And any JavaScript that's loaded in the head is going to block the render of all the other stuff. So it's going to take a while for us to be able to go and get all those body images. So it's important to note also that body images are non-blocking. They'll start to download for your user once they're being called. The second thing that we're going to talk about today is the number of requests. This is a waterfall diagram from Web Page Test. And what you'll see is each row represents a different asset that's being loaded on your page. So a CSS file, a JavaScript file, etc. And you'll see on your waterfall, you may have lots and lots of rows. This is just a fraction of the things that are loaded on Etsy's homepage. It's embarrassing how long this waterfall goes for. And then each of these rows goes across the page to show how long it takes for that thing to download. Obviously, the shorter the better. We'll get to that in a second. So the more the files, the more waiting we have to do to get things back. In this case, our HTML file, which is usually pretty small, comes back quickly. So what do we do if we have got 15 CSS files? Sometimes they might be downloaded in parallel, but this maxes out at a certain point based on browsers. And during this process, again, the browser's acknowledging that it's getting these things back. We get to wait until it's done. Eventually, you can feel how long that takes to load, right? So the fewer files, the better. And let's talk about those sizes. So this is, again, just a handful of things that we load on Etsy.com. And you can see that they range from 8 kilobytes to more than 70 kilobytes for an image. The smaller, the better. So we want to be talking a lot today about how fonts and images and other things that we're going to load on the page should be as small as humanly possible. So how does this affect our page load? The larger the files, the longer the wait is to get things back and process them. So if we have a CSS file that's 30 kilobytes, it's going to take a little bit longer to get it back and process it. And this scenario with a huge image is probably going to take more than one round trip to go and get all that data and return it to our user's browser. So we want, again, smallest files as possible. So hold on to your butts. We're going to talk about image formatting, sizing, and spriting. We're going to talk about cutting down font weights. We're going to discuss semantic markup and repurposability, and also it's going to be important to talk about changing the culture of your organization, your company, or your clients' minds to get them to care about this stuff. All right. I didn't make up this pie chart. This is actual. This is real. This looks at the Alexa top sites, and it says how much, on the average website, what percentage of the page weight pie is made up of images. So as you can see, the average site, most of what we're loading is image files in different formats. This section of the talk I like to call images the nerdy parts, because we're going to go into the history as to why we have so many different image formats and how they each work so you can optimize each of them. We'll start with everybody's favorite, JPEGs. JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. The group began in '86, and they released their first standard in '92. And they are best for photos. We all know this, right? We use JPEGs, they come out of our cameras. It's pretty obvious, right? They're best for photos that have many, many colors in them. Why? Well, JPEGs are lossy, right? Their algorithm is loosely based on how humans see and process information. So they're really, really good for images that have lots of smooth gradients in them and areas that have low contrast, and they're really, really bad at edges, right? High contrast areas. They're really bad at understanding how to process and discard information over areas of high contrast. So what are our options? Well, we can reduce noise and other complexity, right? Again, aiming for smooth gradients, aiming for lots of less contrast. We can decrease the export quality. We've all played with that slider. And we can start to blur unimportant areas. So for the quality slider, I want to talk about finding a happy medium of quality and file size. For most JPEGs, between 50 and 75 is probably perfectly fine. It's going to be important for you to be testing these things as we go. Everything that I'm talking about is worth testing for you and your site. What may work for one image or one site may not work for other images. So I'm going to give you lots of options. So that export quality thing, right? For these two images of lavender, from where you're sitting, there's no way, even from where I'm standing with my screen, there's no way I can tell the difference between these two qualities. On the left is quality 25. It's a very small file size at 40 kilobytes. On the right is a quality of 100, substantially larger. Let's zoom in. So lower qualities have more artifacting around the edges of high contrast. You can see it's like kind of pixelated, kind of like a little bit weirdly blurry. So the higher quality, the larger file size, right? Because there's so much more information that the JPEG contains that we can render this image. Obviously, the artifacting isn't that noticeable when the image was smaller and not zoomed in. So you need to find the right balance of export quality and visual quality. Next, I want to talk about what Jeffrey was mentioning earlier in his talk. So he mentioned blurring unimportant areas of images. This is from a study that Justin Avery wrote up. I've got the link on the website and also on this slide deck. Before the blur, this is Ethan Marcotte, who will be speaking. So you can tell that there's like a background that's pretty unimportant and a very different unevent apart. You can tell because of the blue backdrop. So before the blur, the image was about 200 kilobytes. And then Justin went and blurred all the background areas, and after the blur, he reduced it to 150 kilobytes. Pretty amazing, but I took it one step further. I went and cropped it. So as you can tell, the number of colors and general complexity will absolutely have an impact on your exported file size. So this is great for any different file format. On the left here, we've got that gorgeous blue gradient. In the right crop, you can see there's like a lot more detail. And so you can tell that the amount of information contained in this image really differs. Unfortunately, the left crop, which is the smallest one, is also the worst photo, right? We definitely don't want to just say, okay, the smallest one wins. What we want to say is maybe the center crop could be a good balance between performance and aesthetics. GIFs. So CompuServe introduced the GIF format in '87 to provide a color image format for their file downloading areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about GIFs, but I'm going to say that they should only be used for animations that can't be replaced with CSS. Please don't use them in any other ways. You'll see all my slides will say, please don't use them on here. So, okay, they contain up to 256 colors per frame. They are lossless, and again, please don't use them. But if you must use a GIF, your slider here is going to have to do with dithering. So dithering examines adjacent pixels and chooses a new color somewhere in between them to give an appearance of a smoother blend. So dithering set to 0, you can tell that there's banding in between each of these colors on the rainbow. And on the right, when the dithering is set all the way up to 100, it's a little bit of a smoother blend. And you can tell this has a huge effect on file size, right? It more than doubles. But look at this bonkers thing. This is the reason why I'm asking you not to use GIFs. If that same image, rainbow, horizontally is 9.7 kilobytes, but vertically, when we just rotate it 90 degrees, you'll see that there's, with the vertical pattern, and again, more than doubles in file size. So GIFs are really, really good at removing horizontal redundancy, at understanding and compressing horizontal redundancy. But the more details or noise overall, the larger the file size will be, especially vertical noise. So seriously, please do not use these. Replace any GIF animations that you're using with CSS. Replace any non-animated GIFs with PNGs, which we'll get to in a second. And replace any movie GIFs with asynchronously loading videos. There will always be edge cases here, but for the vast majority of times, test it and you'll find you should use a replacement to GIFs. So some sites like GiphyCat will optimize GIFs for you and then show you them in much smaller HTML5 video formats to save you tons on bandwidth. Look at this. This is the reason why I should be replacing GIFs with PNGs. So GIFs compression algorithm was patented by Unisys. This patent expired in 2003 or 2004. And PNGs came around. Look at that. It's ridiculous, the file size savings with PNGs. So PNG stands for Portable Network Graphics, and they were created as an improved, non-patented replacement for GIFs in '96. So PNG8s are best for images with very few colors because just like GIFs, they are lossless. They've got that 256 color palette. You could affect the dithering like GIFs, but they recognize horizontal and vertical patterns. It's also important to note that PNG8s and PNG24s are totally different, but have the same name for some reason. So PNG24s have no restriction on the color palette, and they handle transparency super differently than PNG8s. So people started to grow sick of the limitation of the 256 color palette when computers that could display more than that started growing more common. So PNG24s, you can guess this, right? Decrease the noise and decrease the number of colors for a smaller file size. So let's compare them. In the PNG8 file, Photoshop was working with a matte color to blend the drop shadow, right? There's no partial transparency. There's only fully transparent pixels beyond that drop shadow. Let's compare it with the PNG24. So we can start to see partial transparency here. Believe it or not, there's a slight drop shadow around those letters. It's important to note, if you want to really geek out about this, this is actually PNG32. It's 24 bits of color and 8 bits of alpha transparency. This naturally results in a much larger file size. But if you don't need transparency, just use JPEGs, because they're lossy and they create much smaller complex images. If you want to get really fancy, level up your game with WebP. So Google announced WebP, Web Picture, in 2010, and it's both lossless and lossy, and it supports transparency and animation. It's pretty bananas. Google did this intentionally to help reduce file sizes on the web. So WebP employs a methodology from a video codec to compress keyframes in videos. It predicts a value from neighboring blocks of pixels, and then it encodes only the difference between the prediction and the actual value. You can create it with Photoshop. There's a plugin. There's also online conversion tools. Currently, it's only supported in Chrome, Opera, and Android browser, but you can still try it today. So we want to talk a little bit about saving even more bytes and requests, right, when we think about that waterfall chart. So I've asked this question many times over the years. Who in here has implemented SVG on their website? Yes. When I first started giving this presentation, like maybe 10 people in the audience had done this. I'm so excited to see that the times have changed. So Macromedia and Microsoft introduced this standard called VML, whereas Adobe Systems and Sun Microsystems submitted a competing format known as PGML. And the W3C recommendation came out in 2001 with SVG. It's XML-based vector image format. So SVGs are rad for so many reasons, right? They scale up beautifully for Retina devices. And if they're online, they eliminate one of those requests to go and fetch content. They are supported on IE8 and less. Who here is still supporting IE8? Oh, this is making my day. I'm sorry for the few people who are not making my day, but for the rest of you, you're making my day with this. We're going to talk a little bit about IE8 in a minute, too. And they do export with a lot of cruft. So if you've ever exported an SVG file from Illustrator, you'll see that there's all of this stuff at the top that you can just completely remove. And at the end, you'll have something very simple, an SVG tag, maybe a polygon tag, maybe a couple of other tags. But it's really wonderful and super flexible. There will be another talk on SVG in a bit. You can apply it as a background, right, using CSS, or you can inline the SVG into your HTML. This is the thing that eliminates an HTTP request. But it's important to remember that if you inline it, it removes the cacheability, meaning the second time that a visitor comes to your site, they're going to have to their browser's going to have to do some work. So, as with everything else, be testing it. Sprites. A couple of years ago, when HTTP2 was announced, I heard a lot of talk in the industry about how I wasn't going to have to talk about sprites anymore in my presentations. We still are talking about sprites in presentations because it's still super relevant. I promise someday we will get to ignore this stuff, but for now, sprites are still super helpful. So what a sprite does is it eliminates all of these individual requests to go and get images by combining them into one. So the user's browser is going to go fetch that one image and then just display parts of it throughout a page. I worked on this website years and years ago in which we had 10 thumbnail slots and about 26 images rotating in and out of those slots, and we were calling them individually. I decided to say, hey, like, what if I just combine them all into one sprite, which is a super weird looking sprite, just a bunch of like faces squished together, and load them dynamically and see what happened with the performance. Because I knew, I had a gut sense that even though the page would bloat in terms of the total file size, as well as some extra CSS or JavaScript to make this happen, it was worth testing. And in fact, even though it added 60 kilobytes to the total page weight, it cut our page load time by 35% because of the impact that it had on the number of requests. So please go forth and test this stuff. So we also want to talk about serving just the right amount of bytes, right? We don't want to serve more than is useful to the user at a given time. And your best bet for displaying a correctly sized picture in modern browsers is to take advantage of that responsive images specification. So this new spec provides lots of different ways to tell the browser which image file to download and when, and you can include a fallback for those browsers that don't support the new stuff. This is for you, IE8 supporters, and you can use this today. So this is a very simple example of the source set attribute that helps the browser determine which image file to download and when. The browser is going to use the size as information to understand the size of the image in the page based on the viewport, and then it will choose whatever it thinks is the best image source. So again, the sizes. The browser is going to look at the matching media query, which tells us what percent of the viewport width this image will make up, and it makes the browser do some math. Source set plus sizes gives the browser choice, and the browser is in a much better position to pick the best source based on things like the device's pixel density and whether or not the user has opted into Google's fast browser setting. I know that we want control as developers. We want to know which image size is going to be displayed, but guess what? In this case, it's much better to let the browser handle this. And one additional superpower of the responsive images spec is the type attribute. So we can tell our user's browser to ignore an image source unless it recognizes the contents of the type attribute. So in this example, the browsers that will recognize SVG will download the SVG file, and the rest will download the fallback PNG. So again, we're able to save our user from unnecessary page weight overhead. All right, let's compress this stuff. I love using ImageOptim, but there are plenty of tools out there. All you have to do is drag your image files or use a command line interface to put your image files through additional compression. It's perceptually lossless. Nothing will visually change in your images, but will save you a ton of file size. We recently ran all of the PNGs in Etsy's templates through lossless compression. On average, it saved just under 20% per file, but for the whole file folder of all the things that it takes to render the outside of Etsy, we save 44% of our file size. Just bananas. But don't do this by hand. Automate it. There's so many tools. There's CLIs, there's WordPress plugins, there's SVG scrubbers, etc. And one more important thing to note here is that when you're optimizing images, you're not just optimizing the perceived performance of the website that's loading. You are affecting the entire user experience, including battery life. So there was a study that was done that took all of JPEGs on Amazon's site and it reran them, it recreated them as JPEGs at like 90% quality, and it found that it saved 30% of the energy needed to load Amazon on a phone. That's joules that we're talking about. On Facebook, it saved 30%. It's amazing. So, affect the entire user experience, not just battery life, or sorry, not just performance. Congrats. You just made it through the bulk of the performance work. So now the images are done, we can take a deep breath, just like Buttercup, and start talking about, oh, look at her. Fonts, the bane of my existence as a performance nerd. I work with some incredibly talented designers at Etsy who take our branding extremely seriously and the user experience, right? They're super good at what they do. I will give you some examples of times when fonts have not always been our friend at Etsy. And this is really important, right? Because IE 638 downloads all font face files that are referenced in a CSS document, even if they're not used. Meaning, like, if you just list them at the top, even if you're not using them on the actual website, IE 8 and less will download all these images, and more recent versions of IE with compatibility mode turned on will also download them. So this is a terrible user experience. So please only import the font weights you absolutely need. This has everything to do with optimizing the size and the number of requests. The more font weights you use, the longer the page will take to load, because font files can be very heavy. The average font served by Google Fonts is about 35 kilobytes, but can be upwards of 200 depending upon language and character support. One additional consideration you can make in your responsive design is to load your custom font files only on larger screens. This is something that we do at Etsy, as we would rather save our user from downloading the extra font files overhead if they're on a mobile device. So this media query will download and apply the font file only if the user's device matches it. Pretty rad. And you can make optimizations to them using tools like Font Squirrel's font file generator to remove unnecessary characters, which is also called character subsetting. So let's zoom in here. Font Squirrel will give you a ton of options in what characters are going to be included in your font file. And at the bottom, you can get a sneak preview of it, which is even cooler because you can start typing in single characters that you want it to include, and you can see the dynamically update to just include those characters. This will help you save a ton of file size in your fonts. But my word of warning here is you need to document which characters are included, especially if there are multiple people editing your font files. I'm going to tell you a story. Vernon, who was a product manager at Etsy, sent an email internally at Etsy. The subject line was horse-related issues. And he said, "Hey, everyone, we've been asking around, but it looks like there are some horse-related issues affecting reviews on some pages." In Etsy forums, users started mentioning a strange occurrence, a horse showing up in their star rating. So as you can see from this user-submitted screenshot, a horse head was overlaid on top of a gray star. This user had 4 and a horse stars. So it turns out we'd accidentally dropped the half-star glyph from our icon font because we hadn't honestly, I hadn't adequately documented the process for updating the character subsetting to add new icons. That meant that instead of a half star, iOS was finding what it thought was the next closest thing, which in this case was a horse head. So it started a really epic thread at work full of horse puns because we all found this hilarious. And in general, we're a pun-focused organization. Now, needless to say, if we had fixed the subsetting, we wouldn't have lost this many hours to replying to an email thread, one-upping each other on horse puns. So please don't make the same mistake. Document your subsetting. All right, semantics and repurposability, and Jeffrey talked a lot about this morning. So we want to save development time and page load time, right? This stuff is not just helping our users, it's helping us as we're developing websites. I once did a cleanup of a template. This wasn't a redesign, just a cleanup. And I found that I was able to save a ton of file savings on our HTML, CSS, and all the style sheet images that were involved in the cleanup. I did this first by creating repurposable code, right? So as you're designing and developing, ask yourself, can someone else use this pattern? Assets that get reused can get cached, which is a huge performance win. Also name elements by function or content, not design, right? Jeffrey talked about this. This is, as we know, debated in our industry, but it's my main recommendation for a small or medium-sized site. A site as big as Facebook should be using a naming pattern that's object-oriented because of its scale and because of how many developers are touching the code. But for your average site, being semantic with your element names can be hugely beneficial for repurposability and eliminating unnecessary elements. Remove all those inefficient selectors, right? So why have a class of wide and an ID of sidebar and a link called search rather than just sidebar search or just search? This is our canary in a coal mine. If we start to see inefficient selectors, that means we're being probably unnecessarily specific, and it will point you to all the places where a pattern should probably be created. Also, start to remove unnecessary elements, right? Our divitis problems. Firefox used to include this really awesome tool called 3D Viewer built into their browser. Now you can install as an add-on called Tilt 3D, and I loved this when I was cleaning up websites because often when you're doing cleanup, it's really hard to say, yeah, I did work today, because all you're doing is making things a little bit tidier. But Firefox's 3D Viewer helped me with this. I could see the nested depth of the elements that I was affecting and start to feel like I was making lots of progress. So this is before and after cleanup. You can see that my nested depth got a lot cleaner. And I did this by creating patterns. So we're going to talk about lots of different kinds of patterns, in this case colors and fonts, but any kinds of patterns will be helpful to the performance and the overall user experience. So this is my visual of what code sprawl looks like. This is every color that we have defined in Etsy's CSS code base, sized by the number of times it appears in our code base. So the rainbow at the top are all colors that only appear once. Meanwhile, these black and gray bars extend another few thousand pixels off screen. This is terrible and terrifying. And we had something similar happen with our fonts. We were using all these different font weights and styles across Etsy.com and our apps. This caused major performance issues. Font file sizes added up, and it took multiple requests to load them, sometimes upwards of 8 per page. We use the different types of fonts differently on our apps and our website, which was a total mess for branding and product alignment. There was no visual consistency or clear hierarchy, and it was really hard to figure out how to design something new with the font stack. It was important to create less cognitive overhead by implementing patterns. So 2 designers at Etsy realized that we used way, way too many fonts across our features. I thanked them. They counted the usage across the site, and there was one clear outlier for headlines. These 2 women decided to come up with a font pattern proposal that used these findings. So they drafted the proposal and started doing research on what would change in the desktop version and our apps. And they got feedback from other designers about the legibility and flexibility of this new font stack. Then they went and tested the changes across pages and posted a link to their development environments so that people could poke around and really experience the difference. They started with the listing page because it's our most popular and important page and was using far too many weights, so it felt the most important to test there first. The designers came up with a proposed new scale for consistency across our platforms too, for even better clarity as people were designing and developing. And then to verify that fewer fonts are better for our users, they ran an experiment with just Guardian Medium as the headline copy, and they updated the font scale for all the rest of the copy. It worked. We were able to prove that this was a better user experience. So these designers then partnered one-on-one with iOS engineers and Android engineers to remove extra weights from the apps, and they've been teaming up with the rest of the design team to make these changes across our site. They saved 270 kilobytes of font weight and 5 requests from our pages. This is huge. And even better, when people are designing new features, new improvements to our user experience, they're able to use these font patterns, and there's no cognitive overhead for our designers or developers. And we're going to do the same thing with colors, too. It's in progress. And hopefully next year we'll be publishing our style guide, which I'm really excited about. So as we've been talking, I've been talking a lot about designers and developers and you know, what we can do as a one-off, right, manually. But I want to talk also about making this part of our workflow. If you start your designer development workflow by thinking about the project from a mobile perspective first, you may be able to avoid many of the problems that bloated desktop sites faced. So designing mobile first can force big questions early, right? Like what the core purpose of your page is and trimming all the other cruft. Create a performance budget. Say, here is our goal. Here is our benchmark for what we're aiming for based on users, industry standards, or what your competitors are choosing to do, or just what you want to aim for overall. Note in your project documentations how you're going to measure it. Web page test or what set of users? What are the specs that you want to align this to? This has been really helpful internally at Etsy. We started doing like a cap and trade program. Oh, you want to add that new font that goes over our budget by 30 kilobytes? Find an image to save those 30 kilobytes elsewhere. It allows us to have the flexibility while still remaining in our budget. And as you implement responsive web designs, you're going to make choices about your content's size as it's displayed to the user. It may be fluid, it may be fixed and change at certain breakpoints, or you may choose to simply not load certain pieces of the content, which is why it's really important to make sure you're only loading the assets you truly need as a user. This is an example of a third-party button, the Google Plus button. Look at that jerk, just loading a ton of nested elements on our web page. This was as they were transitioning from the old Google Plus button to the new Google Plus button. It's a third-party site, right? Like we don't get to control the stuff that they're loading. And then from left to right here, this was Twitter, the old Facebook, like Google Plus and Facebook share buttons. There's no reason why this amount of cruft should be loading synchronously on your site. Always load content that's outside of your control asynchronously on your page. And if a third party doesn't provide an asynchronous version, demand it from them. Or consider replacing them with simple buttons, right? You don't always have to have this extra overhead. Definitely consider performance as part of your overall user experience here. And I'm going to walk you through some pretend choices you may be confronted with in which you have to weigh site speed and aesthetics. We're going to walk through what a compromise might look like. So this is a question I have got, and I'm going to assume everybody in this room has received. Can I put a large hero image at the top of this page? The pro here, right, is that it represents the brand well, but the con here is that it could be a really large file. Hero images are usually very big, often very complex images, and we want to focus on minimizing page weight. So the compromise is like, yeah, okay, hero is cool, but let's be super vigilant about making sure that the compression is correct and we're using as few colors as possible. Here's another one. Should I add font face in 3 display weights and a text weight? The pro is that we've got lots of flexibility in typography. The con is that this is obviously more requests and therefore more page weight. So make a compromise. Use some display weights, but also use a system font for the body content, or whatever ends up working out well for you. Definitely test a bunch and find a happy medium between the two. How will I demonstrate how this product works? I get a lot of questions about, well, but we want people to feel this, we want people to see it and experience it. A video or an animated GIF will clearly convey this kind of information, but we know that these file formats are very heavy. So self-host a video, right? Asynchronously load the video. as you're doing this stuff, make these concessions, but make it clear we are being vigilant about this. We're going to measure it. We're going to understand the impact that this has on our users. My favorite thing to do in these cases is to run an A/B test. If you want to make some aesthetic changes that negatively impact performance, test them to see which one actually improves engagement metrics. Continue to benchmark and iterate on performance as you go. And it's also really cool, by the way, to run performance experiments where it's your A/B testing making things better or worse from a performance perspective. Huge, goes over really well with your very important people crowd like your boss. We have done these things at Etsy, so we'll be able to say, hey, yeah, we're going to make a change to the site that negatively impacts performance, and we're just going to gut check and verify that it's still the right move for us. This also helps us defend our performance benchmarks. It helps us defend our performance budgets. And by working really well with product designers and product managers, we're able to make these kinds of concessions. Make it easy for non-developers to do performance, right? This can't just rest on the shoulders of the people who are in this room. Automate compression, utilize style guides, automate everything in your workflow, tests, image resizing, etc. We shouldn't be doing any of these things by hand because then no one's going to do them after the first time you make the site faster. We have a seller handbook at Etsy. This is something that content editors provide for people who use Etsy to sell their goods. And there's a ton of really gorgeous graphics that are included in the seller handbook. So we wanted the site to stay fast as these content editors were creating this content for our users. So the group of people who are responsible for this are not designers or developers. So, performance isn't a part of their workflow. How do we make it easy for them? So another development team was working on their content management system, and they decided that SourceSet would work the best, right, delivering appropriately sized images to devices. So as they built out the CMS, they made it so that anytime any content editor uploads an image, it's going to be really easy. We're going to, on the back end, just process it into all the different sizes that we're going to want to use in our source set. The content editor will just be going through the process of uploading an image, but just normally, and they won't even know that behind the scenes, SourceSet is providing all of this stuff on the front end. There it is. Makes it so much easier for people. We measured the performance impacts over Office Wi-Fi. Huge, huge, huge 14x savings on users with small screens. Imagine the savings over cell networks. At this point in the presentation, usually people are asking themselves, ugh, okay, so if I do this once, it's going to be cool, it's going to make it faster, but how do I make this last forever, right? Who's going to be responsible for doing this stuff at my job? Maybe it's engineers, maybe it's designers, maybe management. There's somebody in your brain probably who you're worried about when you're making the case for implementing these techniques. Being a performance cop or a performance janitor at your organization is not sustainable. Performance is truly everyone's responsibility. Otherwise, you'll be endlessly fighting an uphill battle. You need to create a culture of performance. But this is probably the most difficult thing when it comes to optimizing your site for performance. We at Etsy even still struggle with it, and we've had top-down management buy-in and a metrics-focused development cycle for years. Again, remember, perceived performance is the most important. I wrote an article on a list apart about this and how helping everybody around you feel the effects that your users are actually experiencing on the website, it's going to be truly helpful in helping you get that culture of performance. Because, we sit at our really fancy office desks with fast connections and probably pretty shiny hardware. We forget what the user experience is like for the rest of our users. I go around to a bunch of companies giving this talk because, frankly, I want all their websites to be fast so that when I'm browsing the web, I have a better user experience. But earlier this year, I got to speak at Hillary Clinton's campaign office, and I showed this video. I was highlighting for them how the impact of how fast their site loads has a huge impact on how people feel about it, right? So you can do this with anything. You can do this with your site with a before and after performance improvement. Start to highlight how much faster you made the site feel for your users. Start comparing your desktop experience to your mobile experience. Start comparing your domestic experience to your international experience. Or compare you and your competitor. It is mind-blowing how much more effective it is on what I call VIPs, right? The very important people, your bosses, their bosses, et cetera, to get them to care about performance work just by showing them what your competitor is doing versus what you're doing. I asked on Twitter if other people are doing this as well, and from across the world, people are finding showing videos to their coworkers extremely valuable and clients. Additionally, I recommend publishing this stuff. So back in 2011, the person who was running the performance team at Etsy, Seth, he wrote our first ever performance report. This is public. We just talked about our numbers. How fast was Etsy loading, and what were we going to do about it for different pages? It was so sneaky what he did, right? Because it forced everybody at Etsy who works there to care about it. Whereas there was just a performance team caring about it before, he was kind of embarrassing the rest of the people that he worked with as if their pages were loading too slowly. And it forced those people to iterate and improve on our most important pages. This act of publishing a performance report also reminded us that these page load times are not secret. There's nothing secret about these numbers. I love it when companies are like, no, we can't publish that. It's too sensitive, but anybody can visit your website. Anybody can run your webpage, your site through web page test, right? Your competitors are probably already doing this. So we immediately started seeing buy-in from development teams across the company, and it's continued to be a focus for us. In fact, the next time we published a performance report, you can see that our homepage originally in August of that year took an embarrassingly long time to load. But by the next time that we published it in November, those developers had seen the problem, they were aware of it, and they worked really hard to fix it, making it one of our fastest pages on the site. And the side effect of all this is uncovering performance bugs that we wouldn't have otherwise seen, which we actively celebrate internally. This is a dashboard that we create and we update routinely whenever someone who's not on the performance team makes a huge win that improves the speed of our site. We love to, we've got a little cross-stitch embroidery thing that has little hearts and the word performance on it. We force them to hold it and we take a picture with them. And we put up a bunch of graphs, right? And we surface this stuff. We announce this internally. We make a huge deal out of whenever somebody else around the site makes an improvement that improves our overall user experience. We even put up bunting, right? Like we really do celebrate this on all of our walls inside the company. And I have started to use that monitor for other purposes. Like again, getting people to feel our real user experience. Web page tests will create these videos for you, and you can have them use any kind of mobile connection, like a simulated 3G connection, which is the one on the right. And you can start to feel how users in crowded areas, in areas with poor internet infrastructure, especially lower socioeconomic areas, right? People who are forced to only use mobile devices, this is their real user experience of our website. I want people who are walking around our office, who again use shiny devices and really fast networks, to see what this really feels like. I call this dashboard, sorry, Australia. Right? We're based in New York. Our closest data center is in New Jersey. We don't feel this pain. We don't know what our users around the globe are really feeling until we force it on you, right? Like I need to put up these dashboards inside the office to get people to feel what this stuff really is like for our users. We need to have empathy, not just with our users, though, but with our fellow designers, our developers, our upper management. We need to help them care for our users and their experience, too. As Brad Frost says, good performance is good design. There's a ton of other improvements that you can make on the back end, but 80 to 90% of the end user response time is spent on the front end. And on mobile, it can be upwards of 97%. So optimize for good performance, and you'll have a huge leg up on creating an excellent user experience. For all of this information, and more, it's available for free on designforperformance.com. I made the book publicly available. I'm so excited for you to go and check it out. I will point out, though, that you should go and buy 12, or have your company buy 12 copies of it, because all the proceeds of the book go to charities focused on helping underrepresented people in tech become more involved and learn more stuff. So please pick that up. And with that, we're going to go to Q&A. Also, follow all your performance dreams. The other thing I wanted to mention before I go is that just today, a book apart announced this other new book that I'm pretty proud of that's coming out. So yeah, so if, thanks. So if you want to do what I'm doing, go and check it out. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.